It is the fifth model introduced in the ROckman.EXE collaboration of 2022. It is RME04 Leader Colonel, with the kits of Buff Trap, Countdown, Hyper Shock, Biped Legs, and the leg ability of High Fly, which buffs all leg stats by 30% at the cost that you take an additional 2.5 times damage from incoming gravity attacks. Now, much like Sword Blues also coming from the 2022 collaboration, Leader Colonel in this case is also packing some new skills to introduce to the game, with a very sleek design fitting of his look and his motif from Battle Network 5. He is definitely going to be packing a lot of very dangerous skills across the board as well. Buff Trap is a relatively new skill we've only seen once before on Urzatine from the Full Metal Panic collaboration, but simply explained, when you put a plant on the field, it'll basically act as passive effect clear, which means that if an enemy with a buff, such as say Stat Cleanse, Shoot Boost, whatever it may be, comes to the line, Buff Trap will check them for that buff, damage them for having it, and then also forcibly remove it, making it very handy for passive aggression, not just in general, but also against anyone that chooses to use buffs, such as, say, Stat Cleanse or even of the like, to help keep stats such as ailments off their allies. Countdown is another relatively new skill that we've seen introduced, but simply put, when you attack the target, it will instill a countdown on them, with a timer of 4. If you attack the opponent 3 more times, of course with that first tick counting as 4, when the timer hits 0 on that target, it is good night. There is no saving it, no reviving it. If that timer hits 0, you are done, no matter how healthy or how close you are to dying. Hyper Shock, or Hyper Thunder, depending on how you choose to designate it, is a new skill that, simply put, is a stronger variant of standard Shock or Thunder, but of course comes packing with pierce damage. So it is very similar to Mizraj Levia, who we saw just a couple weeks ago with the introduction of Hyper Freeze. So not necessarily anything overly game-breaking, but of course having an ailment with pierce damage will be a very nice addition to any team that is looking for it. Now, of course, I am kind of surprised by this too, and very nicely impressed, but I'm honestly very impressed as well with how tanky that Leader Colonel is across the board too. With a head HP of about 4,000, right arm about 3,740, both arms about 3,750 each, legs at about 3,800, means he can definitely take a hit very nicely and keep on kicking before anything does overly cripple him. With his leg stats, though, they are somewhat deceiving between the base stats and his actual stats once he does officially hit the field, and that is where his ability of High Fly comes in. Now, even though his stats by themselves are sitting about the mid-700s, which is still, of course, okay. Not necessarily, like, overly great or impressive, but not very terrible either, as 700 is kind of that sweet spot that you want to be in to guarantee that you have a moderately balanced coverage across the board. But, of course, if you factor in an additional 30% bonus to all stats, realistically, before he even hits the field for terrain bonus or Meta-Rodder bonus, his leg stats would be closer to about, if it's 1409 for his melee resist, he'd be looking at about 18, close to about 1900 for his melee resist, and close to about 1,000, between 1,000 and 1,100, excuse me, between his shoot resist, his evade, and his mobility, which means he's going to be a lot faster and a lot tankier on the field than, of course, the stats here are listing. Of course, at the cost of that extra bonus to his legs, he does take punish damage, and a lot of punish damage, times 2.5 in this case is listed, from anyone that is using a gravity attribute skill. This includes anyone using press, break, break hammer, or wide break. You want to be especially careful of anyone that's using those if you want to prevent yourself from taking that extra damage. Now, in Leader Colonel's case, that actually is a very big weakness of his, despite me grading him moderately highly, because he not only has that additional weakness to gravity-based skills, but he's also packing 2 heavy parts, which means he's going to be taking a lot, and I mean a lot, of punish damage from anyone using gravity skills. That being said, however, I still do have to rate Leader Colonel a very solid 8 out of 10 across the board for what he does come packing with. He is moderately tanky, his leg stats means he's going to be very swift on the field with very good damage reduction, and even between Countdown, which is a very potentially dangerous skill, and of course Hyper Thunder in this case, or Hyper Shock for ailment based, and of course Buff Trap for encouraging or rather discouraging enemies from using any kind of buff like stat cleanse, guarantees that Leader Colonel is going to have a moderately easy time between Hyper Thunder and Countdown inflicting ailments on enemies just by himself, not factoring anyone else on the team. That being said, as mixed parts on the other hand, I do have to rate him about equally at an 8 out of 10, given that you can use most of his parts, his head and his legs especially, just about anywhere. You just have to be particularly careful of that extra of the caveat that comes with his legs if you want to capitalize on those stats.